We will now proceed to the panel. We'll try to keep to our time. I'll say we'll go for about 30 minutes or so. We're very pleased to have Ruth Wandhofer from Citi and Andrew Hauser from the Bank of England to be with us together with Danny on the panel. They will each have a couple of minutes to introduce themselves. I introduced Danny, so you know who he is. And then we're going to proceed to talk about crypto, fintech, how they see it from their side, and where is this all going. Ruth?
Yeah. So I work at Citigroup in the Global Transaction Bank, which is one of the areas that is obviously being challenged or at least asked to transform through all these technological innovations. I developed quite an interest myself in the crypto space over the last few years, researching it as part of a PhD in terms of how blockchain is actually changing financial market infrastructures, also looking at how central banks could leverage the technology to optimize their systems. But fundamentally, the question really is whether money will become decentralized and decoupled from sovereignty in a certain way. And as Daniel explained very aptly at the end of his presentation, really it represent the asset that is sort of generically defined, and therefore it becomes a much more sort of democratized approach to money that is no longer linked to the sovereign in the strict way, but also no longer is subject to sanctions, capital controls, and also quantitative easing and all of these aspects that have been discussed. Within Citi, of course, we experiment with the technology for many years. Because of the network in payments, in trade finance, in clearing and settlement for securities, it is a collaboration that the industry needs to do at large. So there are a number of initiatives that are in progress. Just today, there was an announcement about another successful blockchain case for trade finance. But a lot of this hinges, when you look at the underlying technology, on the sort of absence of a definition and implementation of digital identity, which is one of those core elements when we look at the regulated banking industry in terms of identifying your clients, applying AML, KYC rules, and being able to trace assets and money for clients around the world. So I think we are at the beginning of a massive transformation. It will take some time, but this digital ecosystem is indeed developing in parallel. I would say there are some issues, and you mentioned it yourself, in terms of the difficulty of getting bank relationships. That is still a massive problem for crypto firms.
Are you making me an offer here?
No, no comment here, right? But I think there is a fundamental risk for the development of the ecosystem because it still does rely on fundamental banks when it comes to the fiat part, when it comes to the classical FX risk management part. And I see that working with some crypto trading platforms that I have sort of in my private environment that really they're exposed to risk having to work with smaller banks. And therefore there is a need to make this new ecosystem safe because we're not yet independent from the old financial world, I would say.
I'm out central casting, it turns out, on this panel, because when you listen to Danny speaking, every element of the dinosaur universe he described, I think, is more or less me. So those of you here this morning heard Alex Brazier talk about the Bank of England's work on macro-prudential regulation and supervision. I'm not a regulator. I'm on the operational side of the central bank, and I run a digital currency. I run a dinosaur digital currency, I think, probably, to borrow your language, Danny, from your earlier description. It's very large. It turns over about £500 billion a day. It has around 300 billion of holdings in it, which is about 5 or 6 times the paper currency, or rather now increasingly the plastic currency that is issued by the Bank of England. But in many other ways, it doesn't look very much like Bitcoin. It has 20 or 30 members, which are the large banks. It runs, not 24 hours a day. It runs 5 days a week. So it does very efficiently, but it doesn't do exactly what Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies are set out to do. Now, again, at the central casting, all the way through your there was no whatsoever in rebuilding a closed-loop payment system, and it turns out that's exactly what I'm doing at the moment, in the sense that this system that I described, which is called RTGS, or Real-Time Gross Settlement System, which is, as I say, the electronic liabilities at the Bank of England, is 20 years old. It's done its job very well, but it needs replacing. And the very first question we asked ourselves when we began thinking about redesigning it was, why not build it using distributed ledger technology? We looked at that seriously. We concluded at the time, and God knows a year and a half ago is a long time in this. A common conclusion that central banks have come to. It may very well be, in your eyes, Danny, a commonly wrong conclusion, although I think probably, you could easily say that in a year or 2 or 5 years' time, those challenges will have gone away. If you are right that it's an either-or choice between Bitcoin and traditional currencies, then I'm out of a job. If you're wrong, and I think you are, about whether it can be a substitute or a complement, then we are very much in that market. And what we have been thinking about as we develop this new system, and we're still in a design stage at the moment, is how we can build it in a way that supports and enhances distributed ledger networks that exist across particularly the wholesale markets, because my system is mainly wholesale in size, and supports and enhances those technologies, allows them to thrive whilst benefiting from the benefits of a fiat currency, which clearly and obviously I believe are a little bit stronger than you stated. So that's a complement rather than a substitute model. If you're right, this thing will be a white elephant. I hope it's not.
Yeah, this is a panel. Go for it.
Look, I've talked at length with some of your colleagues, and I'm actually really encouraged by the Bank of England's general approach to digital assets and distributed ledgers. And let's look at that, on two levels, two things that I think are, the objectives which a sovereign might have. The first is there's some really low-hanging fruit to have a digital currency. So what does that mean? It means real-time settlement for trading. It means profit and loss statements for companies don't come 3 months after the end of the fiscal year, but are available real-time. It means you can totally eradicate money laundering, the black market, the cost of a physical money supply. There are really powerful reasons for doing that, and I'm actually surprised that we haven't gone further down there. No one in the world has yet gone there, although there are people that appear to be getting quite close. And that doesn't need to be distributed. That's just some pretty obvious low-hanging fruit for a digital money. Where I think the distributed part becomes interesting is the power that I've seen in the crypto universe is developer power. And I understand, PSD2 and these pretty basic API hooks that you can now get to go into the financial system as it currently exists. But you wouldn't have seen Mark Zuckerberg developing Facebook or Netflix being developed or so on that platform if you'd gone back 5 or 10 years in the internet. It's just this crazy guys in garages coming up with really great ideas. In order to do that, they need a system that's open. Now that runs in conflict with a central bank because you don't want all of your money to be hacked. But somewhere in the middle, there's a really interesting marriage between distributed ledgers, the programmability of money, the open source nature of the programmability of money, and the security that you get from a sovereign. That's the real prize, I think.
So Ruth, I think somewhere in the middle is going to be you. So you're between the central bank and the industry. What do you see the industry developing in this space?
Well, I guess
you're also participating in the money supply, by the way. So it's and in the payment system and credit creation,
absolutely.
right? So maybe that's where the role is.
I mean, if we take, I guess the fundamental question is it the end of banks? Is it the end of central banks? Is it the end of money as we know it? And it is not. We are somewhere in the middle, and we're not even yet in the middle. To give an example, for example, this whole arrival of Bitcoin, the fear of some central banks to ultimately get crowded out on their fiat if it were to really take off, and at the same time the fear of the banking industry that suddenly this crypto universe is taking away the money from the traditional channels and sort of playing in the crypto space, is one of the reasons why, for example, the industry has gotten together in the payment space to optimize payment messages with SWIFT and to have a lot more transparency for cross-border payments, which is one of the most inefficient, expensive, and intransparent areas of business because they felt the pressure. So instead of adopting full-on new technologies and redesigning their own system, they were actually able to use some older rails with some additions to do the right thing, because a lot of what's happening is due to inertia of actually doing the right thing, right? So I would say that on one hand, this innovation has already triggered a lot of positive improvements in the old financial world with tools they already had, because it was maybe a question of inertia and not really wanting to do this. And if there's a sort of threat, then suddenly people ultimately got together to do it. There's also another question when we look at the underlying distributed ledger itself. Obviously, that is evolving. We see a lot of new ways of coding this with privacy, with controls, for closed groups, for semi-open groups, for open groups. So this flexibility is great, and it's really developing. That we are not anywhere near to where we think we could go as an industry in terms of making it applicable to the regulated space. But ultimately, an append-only database may only be useful for some areas, right? It's not necessarily the silver bullet to run the whole organization on. It really depends on what is the benefit and what is also then the cost implications on the industry to migrate over. Especially in payments, we have a network effect and a dependency. If you don't connect all the big banks in the world, they can't talk to each other. So they all need to implement the same technology, which is, of course, why decisions have been taken in your context, not to do it right now because it takes longer, but also the maturity of the technology isn't really there yet, and it's still evolving. So I think it's sort of getting to that middle ground. But what I think is very positive is that all this sort of scaremongering has actually led to a lot of positive change, some with new technology and some actually with the old stuff they already had.
Andrew, do you have anything?
Yeah, there are real issues in payments, and I think I'm almost repeating what you said, Ruth. The aspect of the crypto universe, if you like, well, there's a number of aspects that are positive. One of the most positive in many ways is, as you say, it has got us refocused on the areas. It's interesting that Citigroup in particular would say, cross-border payments are particularly inefficient. It is one area, but it's only one area. Everyone involved with the payment space ought to be tackling these issues. It's not always been the most innovative of industries. Those of us who've worked in it for a period of time, these things give you a real kick up the behind, and they're helpful in that regard. Can I take up an issue about debasement? Because I think Danny mentioned it once or twice. It's absolutely clear that the thing that really kills any currency is somebody losing control of its value. That's what happened to the gold standard on a number of occasions. It's what happens to some countries, some in the third world, some not, when some people start printing money to finance wars and so forth, and eventually people lose confidence in those currencies and they move somewhere else. There is a bit of that actually going on in the crypto universe itself, and we shouldn't lose sight of that, although the rule that Bitcoin is a rather interesting rule for economists in terms of whether fixed supply with this kind of mining approaching asymptotically this total, and what does that mean from an economic perspective, is quite an interesting question. But Bitcoin isn't the whole universe. There have been forks in Bitcoin, and there have been many, many coins added in over the top. That fundamental challenge of debasement applies to any form of money, and it's really the person that can get a grip on a reliable and credible rule for maintaining the value of that money that is most likely to develop a successful currency in the long run. And it's interesting, I quite like the idea of timber coin. I don't know if that's your post-Brexit forecast for what we'll be basing our financial system on in 10 years' time. But, that is the holy grail for people developing coins. It turns out that in many parts of the world, delegating that to a sensible and democratically based form of monetary policy making, I don't want to sort of sing the praises of the UK system exclusively, has proved to be the least bad, to use Churchill's phrase, the least bad approach to trying to broadly maintain the value of that currency. It isn't entirely clear to me what the equivalent of that governance model is, not for individual crypto coins, but for the crypto universe as a whole. And I would actually imagine that even from the investment perspective, that's a bit of a challenge in terms of stock picking, whatever the right equivalent would be, in terms of understanding how the sector's going to develop. But when you crack that, if it's cracked, I do think there could be credible alternatives.
Yeah, I think that's a very subtle question. We can't debase Bitcoin, but we can create other things that look very much like Bitcoin,
right,
that have basically
we could fork it.
The same effect. I wouldn't say a fork was necessarily debasement, because the way a fork works is that the owner of the Bitcoin also is entitled to the fork. So you're not really debasing on that basis. In fact, some would argue you're paying a cash dividend, and that actually has that economic effect in some cases. But I think it is easy to understand money when there is a Bank of England that says, okay, this is money and this is what you guys use, and you don't really have much choice. it's pounds, and 99% of what we spend here in the UK, I'm sure, would be. And that's a model we've grown up with, all of us, and we're very, very used to. There is something really strange that goes on in cryptocurrency where, the one thing, when I mentioned the characteristics of money that I didn't mention, or maybe I did, I forgot, is the sense of community. If Ruth and I decide that my pair of glasses is money between us, it's money, end of story. So, what Bitcoin and all these other cryptos are really communities of people who are coming and going on a day-to-day basis and deciding whether or not they want to be in that community. What are the features of that community that they like? Do I stay in Bitcoin, or do I go to Bitcoin Cash, which has a faster confirmation time potentially? And really, it's whether there's even a need to have this kind of overarching control. If you are prepared to accept the fact that you're in this community today and it's Bitcoin, and you're in this community tomorrow and it's Ethereum. So it's a very different kind of mentality than a trust mentality. It's almost like a truly trustless mentality.
Yeah, it's good to have the glasses as a means of payment. So do you have to pay a third party? Because then you'll have to convince them what the value of the
which is why it's not
that's true. There is this element, and this is where cryptocurrencies have struggled tremendously. Is that convertibility? But that was an argument that I heard 5 years ago, and yet the ecosystem has grown the way it did. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but it seems to be happening.
Andrew, but this issue of just briefly, this issue of governance and trust, I think it's a very valid issue. So the protocol is maintained by core developers. So it's very democratic, but they're effectively elected by their peers, but they're sort of not elected by the public at large. And so if you want to convince the public at large that these are the right people, then it should be some other sort of layer of governance in there, don't you think?
Well, it's right, and what is really interesting about this, of course, is that most central banks, us not least, have really had to face into the accountability issue, particularly since the financial crisis, particularly since the opening up of social media and so on and so forth, and people saying, you can't just be behind closed doors.
You've become very powerful.
Well, arguably central banks have been powerful for a long time, but they've been able to exercise that power without always having to be answerable to those in whose interest they are ultimately acting. So this account, and it's interesting. Alex was talking about this earlier. I guess Antonio was talking about it in the context of banks. This question of how you get and develop and maintain trust is crucial for central banks. We're working incredibly hard at it. I think we score better than bankers on whatever that kind of test was that Antonio quoted, but we don't score as well as we need to, particularly if we are the custodians of every single pound in everyone's pocket. So that is an interesting double back. Could I raise one other point? You had cyber in your title, not your, but in the title of this session. And the thing that really attracted me when I first saw distributed ledger a few years ago was its resilience characteristics. I actually regret that in the way that many distributed ledger developments have been happening recently, that resilience issue has actually been slightly put to one side. So, some of these things like Corda and other things which have been developed on a bilateral basis are important and strong in many ways, but the kind of distributed resilience characteristic, you take out one node and another node just takes its place, is the thing that really keeps me awake at night. Now, I operate a classically centralized system. I do have redundancy. I'm not going to go into all the details, but we do have some, but it's nothing like as big as a distributed network. So from a public policy perspective, it's actually that resilience characteristic more than anything else that makes us keen to look at distributed ledger and try and understand what it is. There is a big but, which is it's the same code base. So although if I take out one node physically, another node can take its place, if instead I take out the code in that network, and the ledger is everywhere, which is a great characteristic because it means it's redundant. Suddenly, I have everybody's ledger in full view. Now, of course, and I think you've talked about this. The cryptographic barriers are strong, but then anyone in the cyberspace knows that if you're defending, you're on the back foot the whole time because the attacker always has the initiative. And although I worry a lot about cyber in a very old world centralized system, I don't think there's been enough discussion actually about what the cyber risks of a highly distributed system will be, because there's such a lot of confidence that crypto is uncrackable. That will not remain true forever.
Agreed. Ruth was dying.
Yes, there's a lot of stuff now. Maybe just one last point on the governance. That was something I also looked at, because for me the question is, and we've seen in the forks that some of the coders didn't go along with the other ones, and that's why we had forks. And that creates sort of a risk if you're not completely within the community and can anticipate that, which is of course also the investment skill, because you know the guys, and it's the same thing with lending and knowing the whales and knowing where to get liquidity from. If you're more on the outside, you have less a fair chance to participate, and it's obviously not democratic and transparent. And I think that is where Bitcoin is clearly an experiment. Other coins are coming along with different features, but we haven't cracked this sort of developer community that if it's too distributed, you have a GitHub, but then nothing happens on the code because it never gets properly changed. Or Ethereum, we've seen code changes as part of the modus operandi because it's an evolution thing, whilst Bitcoin was supposed to be stable. And this is exactly why it doesn't have those stable features of money as a store of value in a way, and the volatility is there, right? So I have an issue with the governance, and that is, for me, that is a dependency on making this work as a separate ecosystem that's more stable, and it is being used as money features as opposed to just the asset speculation and risk that you're taking. I think on the resilience, that's exactly the piece that a lot of central banks are indeed talking about. And there's a difference between the resilience of having the different computers and turning them on and off, and then obviously the code. There are distributed ledger algorithms that are being developed, and one of them was now developed by the MIT head of cryptography end of last year, that have actually features in the consensus approach that make it very secure to an attack from the outside. But of course, if you're running the code centralized and if you get hacked, there is a different problem. And I think that comes back to how much risk and responsibility will you take as a central bank, and also how will you distribute this network to other banks maybe, because obviously for you to have hundreds of servers, it's a bit like a backup system, but it's not really distributed. You would need different entities that can then take part in a different way of consensus so that you have true resilience on the actual agreements of transactions. Yeah.
Just two quick comments really quickly on resilience and governance. Governance. We've seen your boss Mark Carney come out. We've seen Janet Yellen come out with Fed minutes or the FOMC minutes. It is very structured. Every word is measured. Every word is interpreted. That is the governance of our monetary system. It happens in a committee room, and it's delivered to us in a very anodyne fashion. The governance of Bitcoin is like a bar fight. That's just a fact.
Exactly.
And the fittest survive. And that is linked to the resilience. You know, Bitcoin, you can download Bitcoin QT, the code stack yourselves. You can try and hack SHA-256. You can try and hack an elliptic digital curve signature algorithm. You can try and brute force keep private keys associated with public addresses. People do this all day, every day. People attack this network 24/7. And it's this anti-fragility. It is this branding by fire that gives it a special kind of backbone.
Thank you, Danny. We have about, I would say, 10 minutes for Q&A.
It's not mainstream.
Andrea.
Yeah, I have a question. Let's talk about what is trust or trustless as a feature of digital decentralized networks. Now, as you mentioned in your speech, the landscape is quite complex. There are 1,400, as you say, digital coins. So one question, each of them with the different characteristics and features. Some people in the panel raised and highlighted the payment features of these coins, and the discussion was about efficiency as a features of these networks. Another topic that was raised was about the flexibility in the connections with a smart contract. A third feature is the fact that these digital coins of communities or ecosystems that do not require trustless. Now, I would like some comments about that. I remember an interview given by Milton Friedman in '96 at the birth of the internet, who said, this is 20 years ago, well, now that we have the internet, the next step is going to be the development of e-cash. And he used this term. And he used it in the context of his forecast with the fact that the internet was the byproduct of the demand for a government-less society. So how important is this with respect to these other features? And if so, can this be stopped given the obvious resistance by the regulatory and also by the, in some sense, natural competitors of this new development?
Okay, that's the longest question I ever had. I'll do what I can.
You want a translation?
No, I got it. Look, trustlessness. We're kind of doing bespoke trustlessness at the moment. So you've got the DAHs and the R3s of the world who are saying, "Hey, we can give you a blockchain without a native token." That is the thing that makes me throw up usually, because I think it takes away all that developer power I was talking about before. Then you go to the other end of the spectrum, the Moneros and Zcashes and the zero knowledge proofs systems that are out there. I don't think in this current environment they're going to get. I think they're going to be under attack, basically, from because if I was a regulator and I was going after a coin, I wouldn't go after Bitcoin. I'd go after Zcash and Monero for sure, because you know that they're much more obscured. And then you have, in the middle, you have, sensible people like Tezos who have a more sort of mature approach to that, sort of a truly democratic approach. And you have other coins that are just out and out regulated. Ripple will be a coin that's so you've got all flavors, and we're just going to find out as we go forward who goes to jail and who doesn't, and what features are available and what aren't, and you'll end up with the winners. I don't know what the answer is today.
And of course, Andrea, who asked the question, has a new paper that's going viral on the valuation of crypto assets and blockchain type assets. So he's not just asking you. There are also some important academic issues. How do you value it? What's the risk? What is this asset class? And really good to hear from people from practitioners and regulators and sort of where they are on this. I'll collect questions, Emiliano, and then the gentleman behind you.
Thank you. It's not related to government, but investment. So when you started in the space in 2013, whatever capital you wanted to allocate, you would allocate to Bitcoin. And 1 year after, you had an alternative with Litecoin and slightly faster confirmations. And 1 year after, you had privacy coins like Monero and soon Ethereum. And by the beginning of 2017, the portfolio decision was already difficult. And this is before we've seen this explosion in 2017, not just in variants of Bitcoins, but networks that come up with completely different consensus algorithm and reach distributed consensus in a completely different fashion. The likes of Neo, EOS, new projects with Hashgraph, etc. At the same time, the older projects had forks, like you mentioned, and even airdrops. So from an asset manager point of view, how do you think about the portfolio decision dynamically, given that we all get surprised month after month about projects that we did not truly envision coming?
Yeah. I'll collect another question or two. I'll collect another question behind you, and then raise your hand if you want to add to this mix.
Yeah, hi, I'm Aditya.
Question in the back.
I'm a significant investor in crypto assets and an early investor in some of the companies like Ripple, etc. My question is to the Bank of England and to the regulators that were or are in this room, as to what exactly is the legal position of doing a crypto asset management business in this country. Because on one side we have Brexit situation where a lot of banks are moving out, a lot of jobs are getting lost. On the other hand, we have this brilliant once-in-a-lifetime opportunity of this little asset class, no more than $300 billion worth, which will become $1 trillion, or not $1 trillion, $100 trillion asset class in the next 10 years. As to what exactly stops you and why would you want to stop it from happening in this country? I do know that my bank account was shut down recently because they said, oh, we have zero tolerance policy towards digital asset. Means I just want to know, like, what exactly do you want people to do?
Thank you. One last question from the back there. Please keep it short. I mean, these questions are, we have a bit of a time crunch. Yeah.
Hi. Just wanted to ask, going back to the regulation about Bitcoin and tax, about 20 to 40% of payments and transactions in the world are tax-related or tax payments. And because Bitcoin is not regulated, it's not acceptable to the taxman. So I was wondering, what's your take on that? Is it truly a currency if we can't spend it on 20 to 40% of the transactions in the world, or is it just a commodity?
Okay, I'm going to give my panel instructions on
Allocations.
how not the allocation, but actually exact instructions on how to answer it. I had to testify to the U.S. Congress, and then I was briefed on how to testify. And they say, well, a senator, when he's going to ask you a question, pick one word and answer that.
You're not serious.
So,
You're going to do one word.
I mean, one word could be regulation. So you can say, or investment in
I'll
your
kick
case.
off with the investment question. We went from a very simple asset universe to the most diverse asset universe that's ever existed in 2 or 3 years. I've worked myself in diverse asset class environments, but nothing ever as wild as this. We pedal very hard to identify the metrics that drive these networks. I mean, all the things I mentioned today that we now evaluate, we made that up. And we do it because it works. And as that ecosystem evolves and changes, you've got to do it more and you've got to do it harder. 95% of the projects that come across my desk fail within an hour of examination, at least at the first instance. So that's half the answer. The other half of the answer is, of course, we're working with this amazing institution on the taxonomy of the digital asset space and indexation, sub-indexation, zero proof in this, family of cryptos, proof of work family of cryptos, geographically diverse, all identity-based cryptos. We're working with the college here to develop that taxonomy, a risk framework, and a sensible indexation methodology that will capture better and in a more conventional way crypto as an asset class.
Andrew.
With respect, I'm not going to answer the regulation question because I'm not a regulator, and I think I'll probably just end up, talking rubbish. The governance question, actually, the chap who asked it is gone, but I think is a really interesting one. We're surely working through the question of governance and where that ends right now with Facebook in terms of the control of data, and with the more general issue of the taxation issue of transnational platforms, which almost all governments, whether they're pro-technology or anti-technology, are now realizing are fairly fundamental for their future, solvency, actually, not to overstate it. So it is a really interesting question whether currencies will go that same route and initially get taken away from national boundaries, and if they are, when the inevitable challenges emerge, what that pushback will be. We don't yet know, do we, how the Facebook debate's going to end. We don't yet know how the debate about taxation of Amazon and Google and everything else is going to end, but it will end in some way. And I think that is a very interesting way to think about this. There are not many global currencies right now. There are countries where you can use dollars, clearly, but they're not on the whole countries you necessarily want to live in because the domestic currencies have become kind of debased. But a fascinating question, I think.
Ruth?
Yeah, one point is the industry is doing a lot also in the context of Global Digital Finance Initiative to actually create a taxonomy of all these different coins and tokens, because more things get invented every day and it gets quite confusing. So you need to apply very high level horizontals and verticals to ensure that you have a way of defining it without being too closely defined, because the definition obviously may end up in some regulatory straitjacket. So before that happens, we need to make sure we have a way of actually identifying what is what. I would say on the tax payment payments. Obviously, we have regulators defining it as a taxable asset. Some said it's more of a commodity. There's complete inconsistency around the world. Countries ban it, countries allow it. Japan has been very forward on creating it as a payment instrument, and obviously all the banking industry now gets to get crypto resilient with AML solutions because they have to actually engage with that ecosystem. So again, we are more at the beginning, but I think the technology, including this underlying distributed ledger technology, because it is borderless and virtual, has the true power to drive regulatory alignment for the first time. We've seen this already in hindsight with the ICO answers of many regulators, which were quite consistent on investor protection. And I think ultimately the sovereign question is further down the line, but there is indeed a question as to why don't we have a global currency, a global payment system, or something that gets us there along the way. And I think that will take time, but it may be the sort of push and pull, even not only with the financial industry at the private side, but also with the governments and the government sectors as to how they're embracing or being challenged by this in order to become more efficient.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I'd like you to